Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you joining this session on unleashing deploy velocity with feature flags. Excited to participate in this year's Global DevOps Conference. There's been some great sessions so far. I'm hoping you're able to have some great takeaways from my session today. And really, we're not talking about national flags, as shown here. We're talking about feature flags. You might call them toggle switches or flappers or many different names for them. But we're really going to explore specifically the journey towards onboarding with feature flags and how that can affect your capability to deliver to production and deliver to production fast. So just as we get started, a brief introduction to myself. My name is Travis, and I do work as a distinguished software engineer for SPS Commerce. And you're probably wondering, what is SPS Commerce? It's not a household name. We're a business-to-business organization, and we focus on supplier and retailer interchange of data for purchase orders. And so we're the world's largest retail network, supporting thousands and thousands of suppliers and retailers across the globe for that interchange. And at SPS Commerce, my focus is specifically on developer experience. And developer experience is obviously an interesting topic in the last couple of years and beyond. And there's going to be some great talks today about developer experience coming up as well from one of the keynotes, which I'm also excited to see. But my focus on DX over the last little bit has been trying to figure out, how do we make DX better, specifically at SPS Commerce, in terms of how we provide that capability and that level of automation to our customers as well as our internal engineers. And so I focus on this definition a lot when I think about developer experience, which is the activity of studying, improving, and optimizing how developers get their work done. So we're thinking about not necessarily as a developer, how you are enabled to change your address with HR department, for example. That's not a developer persona. That's just an employee persona. Here we're focusing on that aspect of work of really how you're delivering your code to production. And so when we think about that, we think about the user experience of that employee, along with the development principles that you have. And your development principles are often those things that you engage with day to day, those tool sets, those best practices, those guardrails that make your organization unique and how you deliver code to production. And in a lot of cases, if your organization has been around a long time, this is where we see the developer experience problem start to come into play, which is that developers work in rainforests, not planned gardens. That's one of my favorite quotes that describes the problem. This idea that over the last 10 years, 20 years within your organization, you've developed and grown these trees just out of nowhere, and now you're bridging paths between them. And those trees might be, picking and choosing this CI/CD tool, picking and choosing this observability tool, this source control system, and they don't necessarily work or integrate well together if you've had them all or they've popped up at different times. And of course, there's an onslaught of other tooling that you might bring along for the ride that kind of grows inside this rainforest or this jungle that we need to figure out how to effectively build better paths between to increase the quality of life for our developers. And in a lot of cases, we find that developers and teams are just left to fend for themselves, really. This idea that, while a developer comes from another team within the organization, they pick and choose the tools that they know they can make work easily, but they don't have the dedicated resources, the dedicated time to build those paths between those different areas of the jungle that they need to. And that's where dedicated resources for developer experience come in. And so at SPS Commerce, we tend to think of developer experience that we can affect in terms of capabilities. And capabilities are these identified horizontal fast tracks to be curated for maximum efficiency or maximum productivity. So when we think about that across the organization, we think about development, operations, cost, security, and we start to draw out these horizontals that we want to build. One might be, how do we effectively build and deploy a new application from scratch that can be a nice fast track, that can be easy for engineers? Or as APIs are eating the world and thinking about API design and API first approaches, how is that in your organization working out? And how do we effectively take teams from design all the way through to production with some of those API design specifications? Or you might be thinking about inner source and shared library development, and how does shared library development affect the quality of life of our engineers? It does to a large deal, of course, and how can we begin to participate in that horizontal to make it easier for our engineers? But of course, what we're talking about today is this particular fast track. And this is where this talk stems from, which is the idea of building and deploying a new feature to production, something that is obviously a fast track that we use every single day. All of our teams do, as I imagine yours do. And so how do we effectively streamline that to provide the maximum productivity? And that's one of the techniques we're talking about today, which is feature flags. And so I want to start describing that problem a little bit more in detail with you. And I think this will be something that resonates with you to some degree. So let's walk through the particular problem set of a feature deployment and see your thoughts on that. First of all, I'll describe a bit of our practices. We do practice or practice towards the idea of trunk-based development where we have a main branch, and we tend to keep that main branch always deployable. We do carve off feature branches though, and those feature branches are where we build our feature code, play around with it a bit, develop unit tests with test-driven design and approaches before merging it back in with a very short-lived feature branch back to the main branch. Once it's merged in and that process takes place, there's PR status checks that validate in GitHub, all the standard things that you've come to expect from a software development lifecycle at this point in the stage. And so as that code moves forward into the main branch, it automatically gets picked up by CI system. CI system, in our case, versions it semantically based on get semantic version, or I should say get semantic messages on it. So in this case, it labels it as version 1.2.0 before automatically deploying it to the dev environment where it releases it, makes it available. And then it's ready to go to production. And of course, here's where we have a bit of a gate or a stop. And this is the first problem that we want to talk about, which is, what exactly is this gate? What am I talking about? And this can be different things for different organizations. It might be simply your product owner says, well, I know you finished the feature and it's ready to go, but I don't really want it in production until next Tuesday or next Wednesday. Or perhaps you decide after reviewing it in the dev branch that, oh, wait a minute, this developed in an interesting way. I didn't expect this to materialize like this. I'm not ready to release this yet. And so you stop. You don't deploy that version 1.2 to production. And your pipeline, so to speak, is held up. And pipelines aren't really intended to stop flowing. They need to continuously flow in order to provide the value that we want. While you're waiting for that and waiting for that next Tuesday deploy now from your product owner, you start working on another feature, and you might be a little gun shy this time to merge that feature back into main, which causes you some delays and maybe makes some longer lived feature branches that you weren't intending to. And so you continue to work on that, kind of keeping it out of the main branch a bit. At the same time, you might actually determine, or perhaps one of your colleagues on your team finds or is tasked with a critical bug fix in production that they have to roll through. And so they go ahead and they roll that through and merge it back into main. And perhaps they didn't even realize, because there's no mechanism for them to realize that, well, that code actually can't go to production yet, right? It's going to get to the dev branch. You're going to realize that quickly. Well, I was going to deploy this bug fix, but I can't because there's this feature that can't go to production. And so we've jumbled up the pipeline, so to speak, and now we can't independently or granularly choose what to deploy. And sure, you might be saying, well, I solved that problem in different ways. I could have, forked or checked out the main branch at a particular different version and created a branch from that at the version that can go to production, and then made my bug fix on that. That's a little more complicated. I would have had to know those things up front to make it easy. But even if you did that, deploying straight to production over top of your dev environment is not a good idea. And of course, if you decide to say, well, I'll just roll it back to version 1.1 and deploy 1.1.1, the bug fix to development environment first, validate it there before going to prod. Well, that might work, but in a lot of cases we practice backwards compatibility, but not forwards compatibility. What if that release contained other instances of expand contract that you were accomplishing that really didn't make sense to roll out a previous version, right? Maybe you're just intending to roll forward in a lot of cases. It might work, but it might not. So it's hard to say in this particular case. There's no established key pattern when you're rolling out the features in this manner. And of course, at the same time, you have other teams, perhaps internally, that are saying, Service 1 and Service 2, I'm developing against that new green feature. I need that. Can you show it to me in production? I see it's not there yet. Why is it being held back? I need to develop on that in order to release. And of course, they could use your dev environment, but maybe those teams don't want to use your dev environment. I don't like using other people's dev environments based on the stability and expected SLAs there. And so why shouldn't they be able to test and use that feature in production as well? And so, of course, the solution to some of these problems and this workflow definitely involves our usage of feature flags. And so let's look at a simple example of reestablishing this workflow now using feature flags. So as we jump in here, we'll go back through and say, here's our main branch. We're developing our feature 1 again. That's our green feature. But this time, we're going to add a feature flag in there. And a feature flag, for example, right now in our discussion, is simply going to be an if-else statement, right? It's going to be if this feature is enabled, then execute this code. And so at that point, we can merge that back into main, and we can actually establish that via configuration, that feature is not enabled, it's not turned on. And we can keep merging and moving that feature forward and merge it forward into our dev branch, just as we did before. And here there's going to be no gate because we can immediately deploy to production because the feature is disabled. In fact, we don't just have advantages in production, we have advantages here inside our main branch as well. As other engineers grab and pull down that particular feature or rebase into their feature branches from main, they won't have the feature turned on yet either. So we can even launch in development code here without having to worry about it being used. And theoretically, while the feature flag might just be a configuration setting that you have in a JSON app settings file or something like that. Ideally, it's actually a feature decision provider, a separate system. Think of it as a microservice or tiny service that can sit outside and make those decisions for you. And so in this instance, we can have the ability to enable our feature flag and say, hey, configuration in the dev environment says the feature flag is on, it's off in production, allow me to do that deployment all the way through. And so we've actually moved the gate in this case, and the gate now exists between our feature decision provider and production. And this is massively advantageous because now we've actually gone ahead and decoupled the deployment and the release, meaning that the decision on when we want to release is not coupled to when we do the deployment. That allows us to keep our pipeline flowing. And so as we make those critical bug fixes that we need, they can flow right through to production, and we can keep the pipeline flowing. The same perspective, feature decision providers and good feature flagging usually uses some level of context and targeting that allows us to actually take service 1 and service 2 and say, oh, you're internal services, or you are authorized under this particular context. I'll allow you to see the feature and no one else. And so this decoupling and this change of our thought pattern of our approach of decoupling the deploy and release is essential to what we want to accomplish and to providing the velocity that we're looking to provide. So with that being said, let's dive in. Let's explore more about feature flags. One of my favorite definitions about feature flags is, of course, from Martin Fowler, where he talks about it being a powerful technique allowing teams to modify system behavior without changing code. And without changing code is an essential part of this if we're going to do it well. And we'll see that in a couple slides ahead and why that's the case. But he also defines 4 specific types of feature flag categories that I think are relevant to our discussion that you want to be aware of. And the first is the release type of feature flag. And this is kind of just what we looked at, right? It's a shipping incomplete or untested code paths, could be in development, could simply not be ready for production yet from a marketing perspective, could be anything that you want in terms of shipping those features, generally speaking. But we also have operational feature flags. And operational feature flags give us the power of saying, well, we have a technical flag that we want to modify behavior. We want to do traffic shaping, temporary migration with. These flags are specifically for us as engineers for doing and optimizing operational usage of it in different ways. And of course, we have experimental flags. These allow us to test different variations. We're not sure the final outcome of which path we want to choose for a flag. So we'll test different variations in different ways in canary style releases if we need to using this technique. And then, of course, standard permission type flags, which we can designate certain features for alpha testing or beta testing, or even just assign them to specific customers that we know are going to want to see this right away. And so using these 4 different types of flags, we can actually have a pretty large degree of flexibility in what we can accomplish with feature flags, whether it be trunk-based development and really ensuring I have short-lived feature branches, or whether it be eliminating branches altogether and actually doing everything I need to do inside the main branch. Thinking more truly towards CI, the idea that I'm not isolated in my different branches, building just my code each time I commit, but rather actually continuously integrating against everybody else's piece of code that's in development is now a reality based on feature flags. And of course, shipping faster, the idea that now I can keep the pipeline flowing has me moving code to production more often. And you're moving more often because you're also confident, right? You have practice, you're doing it all the time. And confidence is a big deal when we're shipping faster and continuously. But also the idea that now rollback in a lot of cases isn't actually changing the infrastructure, right? It's actually just changing a configuration flag that's there. And so as we keep going in this, you see testing in production is now a reality. This was a big deal for us at SPS Commerce. We used to have 5 environments And that is a lot of overhead, both from a time consumption and from an infrastructure cost perspective. We've now got that down to 2 environments, which is basically our dev and our production, and all those different testing scenarios for different teams and different customers and audiences that want to look at it at different points can literally happen in production as the feature is given to them in that environment. And they can actually test with production data when necessary for certain features, which can be difficult otherwise. And of course, the culture. This is a cultural shift and a cultural change. Not only does it mean that I'm no longer thinking about the order of picking up items in my backlog or planning my sprint based on when I want to deliver something to flow through the pipeline. Now I'm picking up the things in the appropriate order that makes sense and delivering them whenever they need, because it's decoupled from a release and a deploy perspective. But culture also affects us as we talk about the concepts around progressive delivery. If you haven't heard of progressive delivery, this is defined as a modern software lifecycle that builds upon the core tenets of continuous integration and continuous delivery. And so we can use progressive delivery to ship code faster, reduce risk, and just improve our experience. And this term was kind of brought together with the folks at RedMonk working with Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps is a Microsoft product to do lots of different SDLC components and things in it, but they have a great way of delivering software using ringed releases and approaches and moving stuff through stages, getting to a wider and wider audience as they move through that. And so as that was put together by LaunchDarkly, who's a major feature decision provider that we can look at, LaunchDarkly then took it and coined this term progressive delivery. And it's interesting to note that progressive delivery isn't the next level you need to achieve, right? You're not doing CI, now you're doing CD. Now, it's got to be stressful to think, now, how do I figure out how I do progressive delivery, right? That's not what this is. This is actually a named pattern for CI, CD, so to speak. So we think of CI, CD as one way to accomplish that using progressive delivery, which incorporates feature flags. And there's 2 main tenets of progressive delivery. The first is release progression, slowly releasing to more and more users and evaluating that as we go. That's what we've been talking about so far with the flags. But the second part is the cultural aspect of this, which is progressive delegation, right? Delegating the control of a feature to the owner who's most responsible for the outcome of it. Meaning that a feature toggle, I'm going to delegate that probably to my product owner and say, you know what, this is good to go. I've shipped it to production. I've tested it. Everything feels awesome. You determine when and how you want to release that. Or it might be an operational flag that belongs to another team that is helping you roll out or do some type of migration, traffic shaping. Or maybe it's an operational flag that belongs to you and you're going to be maintain the control of that particular flag. And so as we think about that idea around progressive delegation, then we start to move towards these ideas of progressive delivery and the whole sequence together. Software delivery and operational performance is huge, right? The ultimate goal of what we're trying to do is deliver high quality software that solves a business problem, but we're also trying to do it as fast as we can. And speed to market is important. And so when we start to combine and think about the importance of that and what we're doing every day, of course, we're pulling in the State of DevOps report to consider that. And we're looking at the 4 DORA metrics. But what's interesting is every one of these metrics can be and is highly affected by feature flagging techniques. If we think about deployment frequency, the ability to deploy on demand whenever you want, we've just seen how keeping your pipeline flowing and using feature flags to do that is essential. Lead time for your changes. How can you take something off the backlog and get it into production in less than a day to be an elite or a high performer? Well, that can be done using feature flags. Obviously, it depends on the size of the feature that you're delivering. But absolutely, that's a possibility. And of course, your mean time to restoration. If you have an operational feature flag you're using to trim and shape things up, depending on what your outage looks like, you could absolutely restore in minutes, let alone less than a day or less than an hour. And of course, one of my favorites is change failure rate. And change failure rate, I like a lot because it doesn't make sense in my mind. This was a big shift and epiphany for me reading the State of DevOps report. The idea that we should do something more to fail less, right? And so that's what the guidance tells us to do. And in this case, if we fail less than 15% of the time, then we're considered a high performer. And originally that was less than 5% to be an elite performer in previous years. But ultimately, doing and shipping more often and confidently is hugely important to affect this particular metric in general. And if we take a look at that, I can definitely proud to say at SPS Commerce, we've been on this long DevOps journey, and there's been many DevOps practices that we put into play, feature flagging being definitely a core part of that. And you can see that we have a great continuous improvement team that's been tracking our metrics over time, but definitely renders that story entirely true of do it more often and break less. And using techniques like feature flags now, we're down to less than a 3% change failure rate with over 1,000 deploys to production a month using techniques like this. But with some of that kind of stuff out of the way, I do want to dive into code with you for a couple minutes, because I think that's really important. For me, seeing code is all about helping me understand, well, how does this actually change what we're doing with the code base, and how am I delivering code to production? So let's take a look at a simple feature flag example to kind of stoke your mind and come to some realizations on it. So in this case, we're going to create a feature flag, and our feature flag is, well, here it is. It's an if statement, and it's going to check to see if SendGrid email is enabled. And SendGrid is an email provider that we can communicate via API. And so the new code then is inside the if statement, and it says, well, I'd like to send an email to my user. It might be, hi, welcome, Travis, to the system. And in this case, what does that feature flag check actually look like? Well, we could hard code it like this and say return true, it's enabled, and that way I can just go into the code and change that whenever I want. But we know from our definition earlier that if I have to modify code, that means I have to redeploy, which means it's not really a feature flag. It needs to be modified from outside the code base according to the definition. And so the simplest way to change that is to say, well, it's an app configuration. Or maybe that comes from a central database configuration, maybe somewhere else. Ideally, though, in the modern world, it's coming from another service, a feature decision provider that is a service that exists elsewhere that you can communicate with. Send it a key and say, well, is this enabled, yes or no? Then you can send the email appropriately. But in many cases, we're not just enabling flags specifically for a new use case. We're actually augmenting existing code. And so typically you'll find that there's going to be an if and an else version of it, meaning that what was there before. And so that's where we see the old code come in, which in this case, maybe it's just sending through a local SMTP email server instead. And this works. This means I can go to production. It's not turned on. I can easily go to my service provider, feature decision provider, and turn on SendGrid. But you notice that there's no context being used here, meaning that I go to production, I got to turn this thing on, test it really quickly, and turn it off. That's not going to be a viable way for me to test, because some of the power we want to achieve is actually, let me turn this on just for me so I can test it in production and not everyone else experience that. And so we do have to modify, and we have to pass around a context. And in this case, we'll just pass our user context through, and we'll update our function to say, well, I actually want to pass that user along. And that user context probably has a first name, last name, and email that's coming in. And so I'll just configure the email in our feature decision provider and say, hey, when you see SendGrid and when the email is this from the user, now turn the feature on. Now you can see we have a lot more power in production. So as we're rolling through here, there's some important realizations from what we just saw, right? First is that shifting left is happening, meaning that we're taking the complexity of our releases now, and you can see that we just codified it in an if-else statement in the code base. And so that's okay. I like dealing with that in code better where it's more appropriate and taking it out of the source control system. But the reality is that means it's going to affect our maintainability, right? We're adding complexity. It's now more difficult to reason about many aspects about what we're doing. We now need to know if a feature flag is turned on in a certain environment for a particular user at a given time. It's no longer just about the version number that was released and knowing if it is there or not. We have to manage the flag. We have to think about how that flag will eventually be removed and cleaned up from our code base. We have to maintain multiple code paths. And we have just added development time because of all these components that are there. So that's a reality, something that you want to think of. And we are changing existing code. And what does that mean? There's risk. And one of the, I guess, misinterpretations of feature flags, at least I went into at the beginning, was that, oh, I can do this risk-free way to release code to production. And that's just not true. Anytime you have a code change, you know you've made that change that shouldn't break production, and it did. And the same thing's going to happen here. I've broken production with feature flags. But the more you practice it, the more you get good at it. Use unit testing to test your binary situations of your if and your else there. You're going to get good. You're going to build abstractions and make this easier and more difficult to break. And you're going to become more mature at it. And you'll feel confident with it over time. But the fourth realization is maybe you shouldn't be building your own feature decision provider. There can be a lot of work there. We're talking about adding coupling potentially to a lot of services to something that needs to be readily and always available, and provide a good deal of capability around how it rolls out and how it makes some of those decisions. So I would suggest using a decision provider. You can use general infrastructure for key value pairs in a lot of these cases, Console, Zookeeper, AWS SSM parameter store. But moving to something that actually provides context is essential, I think, to get some of that capability that we just looked looked at. So you can use open source capabilities around Unleash, Flag, or Flipped. But really, if you have the budget and the opportunity to get into a full service provider, something that's fully hosted for you, that provides some of these capabilities out of the box, there's a lot of these to look at, and a lot of really good ones built into Microsoft Azure as a service as well. I think there's actually a new service in AWS that you can use. DevCycle is a brand new one that's on the board that you can take a look at. They're doing some interesting things too, some great price points. And of course, LaunchDarkly pretty near invented the full service space in this particular industry. And so they're a great provider to look at too. So as we're thinking about providers, you're also going to want to think about what you're doing with feature flags, right? If we're thinking about UI routing, as an example, you can see here, I want to use a feature flag in my browser code that's actually running on someone else's machine, which is fine. But here, I'm going to think about, well, I'm using React, so I want to pull in a feature decision provider that provides me some integrated components that allow me to do something like this. It's kind of like security trimming here, where we're basically saying, hey, if the feature flag is turned on, then go to this link. If it's not, go to this link. And I spent a great deal amount of time building this particular web page, and I styled it specifically for you out here with the top list that has this home and existing feature. And you can see an example here using LaunchDarkly where I'm actually turning on the feature flag. And notice, if you're paying attention, that when I disable or turn on the flag, it's actually reacting in real time, meaning that I have server-sent events here that are being sent and updating the web page. And so if a requirement for you is to have real-time updates because people are keeping your page open from a Spot perspective for days or weeks or months on end, you're going to want to make sure that that capability is built into the providers that you're using. Another example would be migrations. This is a back-end example where we can use feature flags to say, let's use the strangler pattern to pull out some services from this monolithic API and monolithic database. And so you can pull out those things and begin to create feature flags to redirect. In this case, we're going to redirect our monolithic API and say there's a small section of that called the scheduling API that we're going to pull out of there and redirect over to the scheduling API that we've built that's brand new that can handle this traffic. Of course, you have to think about data synchronization. So maybe that's easy for you. Maybe you have a back-end synchronization option to synchronize those databases. But another opportunity that you can look at is to use feature flags in a more interesting way using double feature flags. So in this case, you might, for example, first have one feature flag that is just where am I going to write information to? And it's not going to choose, do I write to the old or the new? It's actually going to choose, should I write to the new or not? Already writing to the old. You'll start writing to both locations with a one-time synchronization. Then you can use the second flag in a high read scenario to just redirect. Well, where would you like me to read for? I know both data stores are the same. I can begin to test and shift that traffic over in partiality or in whole. So there's lots of capabilities that you can do in how you want to use your feature flag. Another example on how you can use your feature flag would be to dive in and think about coordination. How am I using feature flags across different deployable units? Whether it be UI, whether it be a public API or an internal API that are all deployed separately, how your teams use them and coordinate with them is going to be important as your strategy that you're going to want to think about. You might want to have the same flag across them all. You might want to have independent flags in each one, so each one can be tested independently by the team. And whatever you choose, you're going to want to think about the user context across that. So this is another strategy portion where you're thinking, well, you sent user context of first name, last name, and email in our example, but you'll need to decide exactly what is your context. Is that a user ID, a username, other user details? Is it a role, a group, organization, internal employee, or beta customer? For us, it's an organization. We transmit everything between retailer and supplier, and so we turn things on by organization. Whatever your context is inside your system, you'll have to understand and build a standardized context that you can use. Understand that context is anything that's key value, really, right? It's whatever properties or attributes of really the user that you want to send. And so it could be something as simple as a user ID and a name, or it could be something that we separate a little bit more, first name, last name, so you can do more interesting context. This is going to be essential because it's going to be how you configure your targeting. And so recognize, though, that aligning the context is important. If I were to, in one service, use the flag with name Travis Gosselin, but in another service, use a flag with first name and last name, and I target it, say, hey, turn this on for user ID 123456. Well, that's going to work. But if I didn't send the same context for name, if I target first name Travis, well, one system isn't going to pick up that flag. So just be careful that your context is not equal there. And supplying different user contexts in some cases on feature decision providers can actually have a drastic effect on how much it costs you. So there are tons of other scenarios that you can dive into in terms of log level verbosity. You could use feature flags to augment and change, whether you're in info or debug level settings. You can even change that automatically on the fly. You can do dynamic configuration. It's not just Booleans, right? We're talking multivariant configurations, JSON blobs if you need. You can do kill switches with this as well. So from an operational feature flag perspective, if that third-party tracker on your website is just not performing right at a given time, bake it into a kill switch that you can turn it off and have that feature available to you. Or instead of bringing online new features, use it to sunset existing features, turn off for all new customers, and give the controls and the keys to disable it to your customer success team so they can work with customers and clients in order to remove a particular feature that you're trying to get rid of and replace it with another. Or, of course, time features, right? Holidays, April Fool's Day jokes, anything like that. No need to release the day of or at the time of your conference to demo something. Get that released substantially before and tested so you're ready to just basically flip it on with a feature flag. And so we are out of time for today, but I think there's a ton of value in feature flags in parallelizing that deploy and release. And just think about that value and the capabilities around deferred decisions or decoupling or testing in production that you can pull out of this. But I also want you to walk away understanding that it's not free, right? It's not free. There are some realizations that we talked about, but you can practice it. It will be worth it. And this can be a huge benefit for how fast you can deploy to production and the quality of what you're releasing to your customers as well. So, Veal, do we get any questions coming in? I think we got a few minutes for questions left.
Yes, we did have some questions. So, first of all, somebody asked, can they have the presentation slides afterwards?
So those I did give those to you, Veal. I think you're going to get them out, right? Yes.
Okay, so we'll figure out some way to distribute them out to the people. Okay. So a question that Søren Villavorten asked, what would a feature decision provider look like, and how would you implement one in a CI/CD pipeline?
So a feature decision provider is really just a service itself, like we talked about, right? It's literally a microservice that is an API. It can get a lot more interesting than that, though. And that's what I was trying to convey in what we were talking about there, which is there's a lot of additional components to a feature decision provider you might want to consider. It's very highly coupled to a lot of your system, meaning that if you start to introduce feature flags to all of your services, for example, you might then ask the question, wait a minute, well, what if my feature decision provider goes down, right? It needs to be very highly resilient and is typically, I suggest, not something for customers to build themselves, mainly because there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And if I take a look here at a feature decision provider example in the resiliency, there's an example of the resiliency provided by LaunchDarkly specifically. And I won't go through the entire slide here, but you can see that the stuff that exists in between calling LaunchDarkly. LaunchDarkly is a major feature decision provider. They exist inside AWS. They have global CDN Fastly in front of them. You can institute your own relay proxy that is backed by Redis for full caching as well. So if it's fully, even if the global CDN somehow is down, you can have your own internal relay proxy that's caching all this stuff. And you can also be using fallbacks in your code to ensure there's no single point of failure there. But because of all these things that go in place, that's why I suggest to say that you're going to find a lot of value in using one of these existing providers that are out there. Now, if the second part of that question, I think, was, can I use it in CI/CD? And so when I think CI/CD, I think you're talking about, hey, can I use feature flags to enable different aspects of my CI/CD pipeline? So in that regard, you'd be a operations team, for example, using feature flags to enable different aspects of like an internal developer platform. I'm not sure if that's where you were going with the question or not, but that is a viable option as well. And that is something that I do quite a bit often in developer experience spaces, deliver new functionality specifically to our teams. This is an example showing where we rolled out in the build API specification linting and roll out publishing specifications by including feature flags directly in our CI/CD that just enable that for some of our teams to begin using and exploring. So two very different topics there on the decision provider versus using flags in a CI/CD. But I'm hoping that catches or is the answer to your question there.
Yes, it was. And then we have another question. Where should one store such feature flags? In a config map or a secret or a web server? Where else?
Yeah, so great question. Again, that would be the feature decision provider, right? So they're going to have an API that you're going to communicate with well-defined SDKs that you can call and run. That'll basically be, is this flag turned on? You basically say, launch Darkly, is flag on? Give it a key, pass the context. It handles the rest. You can create and store these flags in different ways. You can use infrastructure as code. You can use Terraform to automatically create it as a part of their platform and their system. And you can manually go to UI portal if you want and take a look at it as well. And just looking here for an example of a portal, you can see here's an example of Launch Darkly portal. You can see some created feature flags, and you can go in and literally hit the button to create a flag, set it up in your dev environment, and begin to play with it. And it provides you different environments, so it automatically understands your dev, your production. It knows the feature flag is where, because you'll be communicating those environments. You drop a key in your code base and then start asking it whether it's enabled or not. And then here you can turn these flags on and add the different variations in the context that you communicated with it in a pretty easy way.
All right. I think that was actually a very enlightening answer. And then how long do you typically recommend keeping feature flags around? Are they permanent or typically have a lifespan? I think
that's such a good question. I love that question because that's a hard one. And I have maybe a more opinionated answer than you like. And so we didn't have time to dive into life cycle today. There's a lot of good life cycle questions. And just dropping down here too. How long do you keep a feature flag around for? And this is where you're going to want to check out. I love Martin Fowler's guidance again for feature flags. And here they talk about the longevity versus how dynamic something is. And so if you take a look at it, a release toggle based on the 4 types we talked about, is pretty short. Like I want to release something as fast as I can, get it out and remove the flag. Understand there's debt for every feature flag that you introduce. And so getting rid of it sooner, the better. It means less code paths, right? Less maintenance on your unit tests, less performance execution time in your CI/CD. And so release toggles should be pretty quick. Experimental toggles might live a little bit longer, depending on how long you need that experiment to run for. But you can see here that permission and ops toggles, potentially, they could live indefinitely for years. And this is where kind of my opinion comes in. I've seen the hardest part of feature flags is that cleanup is really, really difficult. And so for me and our opinions at SPS Commerce, we actually don't allow teams to use feature decision providers for long-lived ops toggles. We do for short-lived, like if you're doing a migration, it's going to take 3 months, that makes sense. Or definitely not permission toggles. So we actually bake those types of toggles as features into our system, and that allows us to have a separation of like, here's an admin interface for us to use and for our customer success team to use. And here is then the temporary toggles that we're using, we're developing with day to day. So we kind of separate features of the system versus development practices a little bit in order to draw that divide much more specifically. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. I would just suggest that, longer these toggles live, there's an added debt to pay.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for either one or two more questions. And somebody asked, what if a new feature requires to change some shared code with another feature? Is it going to be an if-else nightmare?
Read that one to me one more time.
Okay. What if a new feature requires to change some shared code with another feature? Is it going to be an if-else nightmare?
Oh, okay. So I think you're talking about the idea of, should I include an if statement inside an if statement or a feature flag inside of a feature flag? And that actually references slightly above, how do I know when I do not need a feature flag? And so just going back up to that statement, part of it is shifting the mentality. So the question a lot of teams ask is, how do I know when I need a feature flag? And of course, you want to shift that and say, well, I'll always use a feature flag. But there are times where you're right. It does make sense that you don't necessarily need one. Times that there's no risk, or maybe you're applying a bug fix and the whole system is down and you couldn't possibly make it worse, which I know that's probably famous last words, but those situations I think do exist. Or you can see here another feature flag. If you're already inside a feature flag, you'll have to determine if it makes sense to add another feature flag inside there or just roll out with the existing one. And that really depends on where that is in terms of rollout. If that flag is already rolled out 100% to everyone and just hasn't been cleaned up, you probably need a new one. Maybe that's a good opportunity to clean up the other one. But if it hasn't yet, if it's not 100% rolled out, maybe you can roll it out as a part of that existing flag. The other aspect to this, I mentioned one of the feature decision providers earlier was DevCycle. And DevCycle is interesting because they provide the ability to do grouped feature flags, in which case you could start to group feature flags together to kind of give yourself an understanding that, well, this one is nested inside this one, and build that context in your decision provider.
All right. I think we are pretty good on time. So thank you so much, Travis, for a very enlightening talk on feature flags. I at least learned a lot. And can you please give Travis a big hand in the chat?
Thanks, all. Appreciate chatting with everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hi, we're from EFICode,
who brings you the DevOps conference.
Continuous delivery has been a key focus for over a decade, and platform engineering is its natural evolution.
If you want to remove the pain and uncertainty from your software development, we'd love to help you.
Discover more at EFICode.com
and enjoy the insightful sessions at the DevOps conference.